The Antisemitism Awareness Act is poised for a vote in the U.S. Senate after passing the House earlier this month by a large majority. The bill would write into law the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism, which civil liberties groups say will both suppress criticism of the State of Israel and make it more difficult to address actual anti-Semitism. Pro-Israel politicians have been pushing for the bill since 2016, but appear to be capitalizing on the climate of fear that has arisen in recent months over demonstrations against Israel's continued war on Gaza. So what will this mean for pro-Palestinian organizing, as well as for conversations around anti-Semitism? Joining us to discuss this is Rabbi Jay Michaelson. He is a contributing columnist for The Forward. And we also have Lara Friedman with us, president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Thank you both for joining me. Lara, I'm actually going to start with you. If passed, this bill is going to write the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism into federal law, saying that, quote, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Now, this, in general, seems like a pretty benign definition, but Human Rights Watch, the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, and B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights group, and others are sounding the alarm over adoption of an IHRA definition. Why?
So the battle around the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism has been going on, as you said, since 2016. And it really isn't over the sentence you read, although experts on anti-Semitism will say that that sentence is badly written and doesn't really say much. The battle is really around a set of examples that are appended to that definition, and there's controversy over how they became appended to it. But those examples, the majority of them deal not with hatred or discrimination or threats or violence against Jews as Jews. They deal with criticism of Israel. And this is the latest controversy. This isn't the first with the Antisemitism Awareness Act, is that this is really a stealth effort to redefine anti-Semitism to not only include criticism of Israel, but to focus on and prioritize it, and then have that as a weapon against Palestine rights activism, against organizing, and even against Jewish people around the world who criticize Israel. Because according to that definition's examples, for example, if you're an organization like mine, which focuses only on Israel-Palestine, we're narrowly focused, people argue, well, that means you're anti-Semitic, because under the IHRA definition, criticism is deemed to be anti-Semitic if you are not equally criticizing all others who are guilty of similar bad behavior. Which is sort of like saying you can't have an organization that focuses only on the welfare of, say, elephants. If you focus on the welfare of elephants, it means you're anti the welfare of every other animal, right? There's something inane about this to suggest that in order to engage in criticism of Israel, you have to be an anti-Semite. That's what it's setting up as an argument.
Jay, what do you say to the person who pushes back to that argument that Lara just laid out and says, yeah, but there has to be some room to criticize a very real practice of isolation? For example, if we criticize Israel for having an imperfect democracy, right? All the nations in the world that call themselves democratic are imperfect democracies, but if we only focus on Israel's, then that represents an example of isolation and exceptionalism and ultimately anti-Semitism. What do you say to people who say that these kinds of double standards are the problem?
Well, I think the question is whether it is a double standard. I mean, Israel is a uniquely situated among all of the countries of the world. It's leading recipient of U.S. foreign aid. It has there is a whole special relationship between the countries. There are many reasons why one might focus on the imperfect democracy, to use your phrase, in Israel rather than somewhere else. It's just as Lara said, there are many reasons why you might want to focus on the, let's say, misdeeds or actions of one country and not necessarily another. Again, Israel is reliant on American foreign aid, so these things are happening on our dime. The IHRA definition has no space for any of that nuance.
Now, Jay, if the bill is passed, the Department of Education is going to be required to use the IHRA definition when judging anti-Semitism complaints within American universities and against universities. It'll also revoke funding for schools that fail to discipline or even ban events, professors, campus groups who speak out against Israel. Now, Jewish Currents warns us that we're seeing an unfolding, what they call moral panic, that parallels the Red Scares of the 1920s and the 1950s. How do you see it?
I mean, I described this as a moral panic back in December, January, where we saw university presidents hauled before a congressional committee in a process designed to trap them. And I think what's interesting about moral panic is it is a panic. There are a lot of reasons, and I think it's important to make space for this. There are a lot of reasons why American Jews do feel profoundly unsettled right now. Obviously, October 7th and the unprecedented horrors of that day, and then also the ways in which many of our allies in the progressive community either did or didn't respond. And then the eruption of both legitimate, I would say, anti-Israel protest and illegitimate anti-Semitism. And American Jews are in this really heightened state. And it's a very tough time that a lot of people are experiencing. And that condition is being weaponized by opportunists, primarily on the right, to further their own ends, which are really about attacking all kinds of university education, attacking what they see as instruments of liberal culture and indoctrination and so forth. That Jews have been enlisted in this war on woke is a tremendously cynical, I think, exploitation of the real pain that so many American Jews are feeling right now.
Lara, there's been a pattern in recent years of defining anti-Semitism very, very broadly. In the U.S., the Anti-Defamation League has tallied a near 400% increase in anti-Semitic incidents since October. This number, however, explicitly counts all Palestinian solidarity activism as anti-Semitic, spurring opposition from even people inside of the ADL. I mean, you have ADL staffers saying, hey, this is too broad, we're going too far. That's a red flag. What does this trend mean for efforts to actually combat anti-Semitism?
Look, I mean, as we move further and further away from what is the common sense understanding of what is anti-Semitism, which really boils down to threats, discrimination against, violence against, hatred of Jews because they are Jewish, and you move further and further into conflating being Jewish with supporting Israel, which, let's remember, has always been considered anti-Semitic. You open the door for a whole new surge of real anti-Semitism, which you don't record and you're not watching because you're giving cover to it by saying, well, they support Israel, so they're not anti-Semitic. And by the way, we're much more worried. And if you look at the last couple ADL reports, you'll see that even in their huge surge they're saying of what they call anti-Semitism, the majority of anti-Semitism that they're recording is not related to what they call Israel or hatred or protest against Israel's treatment of Palestinians. It's actual hatred against Jews. But if you read the headlines, all they're focusing on is the Palestinian rights protests, criticism of Israel and what it's doing in Gaza. They're prioritizing that and the fight against that above all else.
Well, first, picking up on what Lara just said, if you compare the anti-Semitism that is present in some quarters of the far left to what's happening in the far right, we've got a Holocaust denier being the Republican nominee for the governor of North Carolina. That is a way more serious threat, I feel, as a rabbi, to my own safety, to the safety of American Jews, than any anti-Semitic events that happen on a college campus, by a lone activist here or there, or by somebody who's maybe even coming from the outside and kind of trying to stir up trouble. There is just no comparison. There's no Democratic equivalent with Donald Trump dining with Nick Fuentes, for example, noted white supremacist and anti-Semite and neo-Nazi, basically. So there's there's sort of a comparison or an equation of occasional oversteps on the left, or I would say, and I do think that at some campuses, student protesters could do a better job of drawing clear lines, making sure that no individual Jewish students are being harassed in any way, making sure that no conspiratorial claims about some Jewish conspiracy controlling politics are made in any way. However, the vast majority of those protests are at the appalling nature of the war in Gaza. And I may agree or disagree with, everything some activist says, but that is a political protest, obviously. And I want to add one thing, which is, I think it might be helpful for viewers to kind of see where some of the Jewish students are coming from on these campuses. I grew up in the conservative Jewish movement, kind of the middle of the road in terms of religiosity in America. And Zionism, not just love of the land of Israel or historical ties to the land of Israel, but political Zionism was part of my Jewish education. and it became part of my Jewish identity when I was a teenager. And to see that attacked can make a lot of folks feel as though they're being personally attacked. And so I think it would be helpful to just sort of
what do we do
know
with that?
That's a lot of the case.
I was going to say, what do we do with that logic, right? So if we say political Zionism was baked into this, in the same way that maybe slaveholding was baked into, early American, education system for white Americans, right? And any disruption of people's way of life can be unsettling, and it can feel as a personal attack. But at the moral and political levels, how do we respond to the fact that people personalize those things?
No, that's right. I don't love that analogy, but even so, I think that just because somebody feels as though they may be being targeted because of their identity, that doesn't mean that that's what's actually happening. I think we could both sides, so to speak, could do with a little more empathy of what's happening. I think Jewish students on campus do feel as though they're under attack. We could kind of understand that subjective experience without weaponizing it and enlisting the role of the federal government to police speech and to punish campuses that don't punish free speech, right? That's clearly not the way to deal with the pain that people are feeling. I think it could also, and conversely, people who are concerned about these protests and who are scared by these protests could use a bit more empathy with the protesters, let alone with the people in Gaza, of course, and could see where they're actually coming from. But in neither case should the power of the state and the power of the purse strings and also the criminal power of the state to punish crime be enlisted to patrol political speech.
Lara, journalist Masha Gessen has pointed out that even the acclaimed German Jewish philosopher Hannah Arendt would be labeled anti-Semitic under the IHRA definition, specifically the portion that deems, quote, comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. Arendt, widely considered one of the 20th century's greatest scholars on anti-Semitism, genocide, and the Holocaust, once compared a Jewish Israeli paramilitary group to the Nazis for attacking and killing an Arab village. If this does become the legal definition of anti-Semitism, where does it ultimately leave Jews who are critical of Zionism?
Well, I mean, much like the debate around the demonstrators and the protests right now, it effectively invisibilizes Jewish people who are critical of Israel. It effectively deems them not existing in the debate, or it deems them not Jewish and therefore legitimate to. And we have terms that have come up in recent years like un-Jew or as a Jew. I mean, or Gino, Jew in name only. I mean, there is a new framework being brought in by some parties who really want Zionism to be Judaism, which says that if you are not an ardently Zionist Jew, you're not really Jewish. And by contrast, if you aren't Jewish but are ardently Zionist, you are kind of Jewish or more Jewish than the Jews who criticize. So we're in this moment of great ironies where, you have this enormous pressure, a lot of it from forces like the ADL, but also forces like the anti-woke right, who are not particularly interested in Jewish safety, saying you must pass this to protect Jews, even as it will, invisibilize a large part of the Jewish population in the United States and other places, and in Israel, that is extremely critical of Israel and does not believe that Zionism is exactly the same as being Jewish.
Lara Friedman, Rabbi Jay Michaelson, thank you both so much for joining me in UpFront. Everybody, that is our show. UpFront, we'll be back next week.